Well, hello. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about pruning. My name is Aaron Esri, and I am the Assistant Extension Specialist for Viticulture and Enology here at Oklahoma State University. And we're going to talk about pruning a grape vineyard today. So where to start? First, you would want to start with assessing bud damage. This is where you go in and you take samples of canes, you dissect the buds to get their viability, and then you calculate your percentage of live buds or dead buds. Then you prune during dormancy, and the closer you can wait to spring to prune, the better. You want to hold off as long as you can and prune right before bud break. That you have to take your vineyard size into account. If you have a very large vineyard with minimal help, you obviously need to start earlier. If you have a small vineyard or lots of help, then you can wait a little later in the winter to prune, but vineyard size makes a difference. I like to incorporate something called a rough prune, fine prune. That's where you go through and you essentially trim the vines down. You give them a haircut. You get rid of all the excess. That's a rough prune. And then you go back and you meticulously fine prune. You go and you count buds. You say 1, 2 cut. 1, 2 cut. That's a fine prune. You make 2 passes through the vineyard doing that, but I find it to be much better as well. And then finally, you're going to want to rake your vineyard floor after all this is done. So you have all these canes laying in your vineyard. You want to rake them up, push them into a pile, and just burn them. So assessing bud damage. What this is while the vines are still dormant, you have all these dormant canes. You go through and you collect 10 canes per variety with 10 buds per cane. So that'll give you a total of 100 buds per variety that you'll assess. You bundle them up, you bring them inside, and you let them warm up for 24 hours. Once they're acclimated to room temperature, you then take a razor blade and you just cut through the bud. If you can make 2 cuts, one at the top half and then one at the bottom half, that just gives you some insurance into the viability. But you dissect the bud with a razor blade. Green means healthy and alive, brown means dead, and it's that simple. And then you calculate your viability or your death percentage. You just take the total bud sampled, take the amount that is alive, and that gives you your percentage. So if I have 100 buds that I'm assessing on one variety and 80 of them were alive, that means I have 80% bud viability or 20% bud death, however you want to look at it. And then you adjust your pruning practices based on bud viability. So dissecting a bud, this is what it looks like. You just make a cross section cut through the top half of the bud, and then you make a second cut just below that cut, just to ensure, duplication of efforts. But yeah, that middle picture there shows the dormant bud, and that red line shows you where to cut. And then the picture on the right shows you a live primary bud and then a secondary bud as well. And that is a live, healthy bud. So after you assess your bud damage, you can then adjust your pruning practices based on that. If you do this and you have less than 25% bud damage or bud death, you change no pruning practices. You prune just as you did before. If you have 25 to 50% bud death, you might want to leave an extra bud or 2 at pruning. If you have 50 to 75% bud death, you might want to leave double of what you pruned last year, which will likely be 4 to 6 buds per spur. And then if you have over 75% bud death, you want to minimally prune, even so much so as to wait until the vines actually bud out before you prune. You can do that. Now, if you have 75% bud death and you minimally prune, that's very hard to manage the canopy come the summer. And it's tough to do commercially. If you're growing these grapes from wine production commercially and you have 75% bud damage, that's going to be a rough growing season on you this year, because it's leaving that much canopy or leaving that much dormant canopy on top of new season growth is just cumbersome to manage. So pruning, again, so when I'm talking about pruning these grapevines, I'm talking about pruning them for wine production, for pruning them back to grow grapes to make wine. So this is commercial pruning. How are your vines trained? Are they spur trained on a cordon, VSP or high cordon? Are they head trained or are they cane trained? and we'll talk about all three. So equipment needed, just a good pair of pruners. I prefer Felco. They're Swiss made, they're very nice. Gloves, disinfectant spray, and tie tape. So this is two examples of what a spur cordon train vine looks like. To the left is vertical shoot position, which is where your vines grow up. You have two cordons and then the shoots grow upward in a vertical position. And then the right picture shows a high cordon vine where the vines grow up to about 6 foot or so. You have two cordons go to the side, but then your shoots grow downward. Just a different training system. There's no right or wrong. It's just your preference. But as you can see, the right picture kind of shows you an anatomy of the grapevine. You have your trunk, you have your cordon, you have your spurs, your renewal spurs, and then you see that label of a sucker to the bottom there. You always want to cut your suckers too. Always go through your trunk, eliminate all suckers. So pruning a grapevine, I drew this picture. You can see the red dots are buds, and then I've drawn lines where I would cut. The right side of the vine is pruned, the left side of the vine is not, again in the drawing. And so you kind of have shows your labels of where to cut, what to look for. But the principle is to leave 2 to 3 buds per spur with 5 or 6 spurs per cordon. That's standard commercial practice for producing wine grapes. Sort of the same thing, except with a high cordon, you know, they grow up tall and the shoots grow downward. But the principle is still the same, leave 5 or 6 spurs per cordon, and then leave 2 or 3 buds per spur. 20 to 36 buds per vine total. And then you just go through, you count your buds, you count to 2 or 3, however you want, and you cut. This is a rough prune. This is a demonstration of what I mean by rough prune, fine prune. So as you can see in the picture on the left, that blue line indicates a rough prune. And there's no precision with a rough prune. You're just cutting off excess canes, because in a vineyard, a dormant vineyard has canes that are sprawled all over the trellis. I mean, they're all over the place, and it can be really hard to actually try to pick out buds and fine prune. So what you can do is you just take that big excess and you just snip it. You just cut it right through the middle, you know, roughly a foot or so, 6 to 10 buds. You're not even thinking, you're just cutting off the excess. That's a rough prune. Get rid of it. Then I can go back and do a fine prune. And again, you are making 2 passes when you do this, but I come to find I prefer this method as well, because once I rough prune, I now only have, you know, a 1 foot tall cane that I can easily go through and identify buds, spur positions, and I just find it easier to do. So you do a rough prune, and then you go back and you do a fine prune. Everything's labeled there. Blue being rough prune, the green being fine prune. And of course, the red dots are buds. And this is what a finished spur cordon prune grapevine looks like, growing on a VSP trellis system. So basil buds. Basil buds are not counted when pruning, and it takes a little bit of a practice to identify basil buds. If you're a seasoned vet at growing, you should do this no problem. But if you're learning, it can be a little tricky at first. But a basil bud is essentially a bud that grows at the base of a spur or a cordon, and it grows like right at the base, as you can see. But you don't count those. You count the buds after on the cane. You just count up 1, 2. So you see the picture there. That's your first bud. That's your second bud, and then that's the pruning room where you cut. But you do not count basil buds when you're pruning. So a little bud anatomy. Grapevine buds have a primary meristem, a secondary meristem, and even a tertiary meristem, which are growing points. These are essentially new season shoots, or can be new season shoots. The primary meristem is the one right in the middle, and it's the most fruitful. The secondary meristem is like a backup meristem in case the primary one is damaged. The secondary one will grow. It is less fruitful, but it still will produce some fruit. Your tertiary meristem is almost always never fruitful. And if your grapevine is pushing tertiary meristems, that means it is in survival mode. If you have tertiary meristems coming, you likely will not get any fruit this season, and your vines are just trying to stay alive. And an abundance of sunlight, sometimes you will get both primary and secondary meristems to grow at the same time, in which you would have to go through and shoot them. Or if there's a spring frost. So let's say we prune March 20th, the vines start to bud out, and then April 10th, we get a freeze. Well, that growing shoot is probably going to die, but if your secondary meristem did not bud, now it will. And so now after the freeze, everything dies back, your secondary meristem will bud and you'll still get some fruit. That's the tricky part and the tough part about growing grapes is a late spring frost, and you never want them to happen, but sometimes they do. So a head train grapevine, these are really neat to see. There's a lot of them in California and then also in Europe too. That's just how they used to plant them without a trellis. They would just plant them in the ground and they essentially become stunted trees. But the principle is still the same. They just, your cordons are now just all over the place. They look like stunted trees really. And then you still have spurs and buds, and you just count back your spurs, count back your buds, and you prune them. They're neat. They're head train vines are grown on a stake and nothing more. And it takes a few years to get to that point to where they look like that. But once they do look like that, it's pretty cool to see. So that's a head train grapevine. Another way of training a grapevine is a cane training or cane pruning. And this is where it's kind of a mix between cordon and head train, except your cordons are now just 1-year-old canes. So when you cane prune, you're cutting everything off except for 2 1-year-old canes. And then you just lay those down on the wire, and every bud on that cane will shoot out and produce fruit. So that's the idea there. Instead of having permanent cordons and permanent spurs, you just have 1-year-old canes that you replace every year. And again, you're going to have 20 or 36 buds per vine regardless. So this is just another way to do it. There's no wrong or no right, but you just retain a 1-year-old cane or 2 1-year-old canes, and you keep all the buds on the cane because you have like 12 or 20 buds per cane. You just lay those down on the cordon wire, and every single bud will shoot out and fruit, and that's just another way to do it. So with that, laying down new cordons. If you do have a cordon, if you do grow spur, if you do have spur cordon trained vines, whether it be DSP or high cordon, sometimes you do need to replace a cordon, whether they just die back or they become less fruitful, or maybe your spur positions just get out of whack. Maybe you get a canker virus or something. Sometimes you just have to replace cordons. Well, to do that, you just pick a strong, healthy 1-year-old cane and you lay it down and you tie it onto the trellis like a cordon. It's good to establish cordons at 2-year intervals. It takes a little more time to do that, but it's also very proper to do that. So you would take a strong, healthy 1-year-old cane and you just lay it down in a good position, cut it about 18 inches, let it grow, let it push buds for that year. And then the next year, you would take the very tip or a good position on the end of the current cordon and you lay down another 12 or 18 inches, however much space you have in between your vines, to fill out the rest of your cordon. So that's how you establish cordons. You just pick a healthy 1-year-old cane, lay it down, tie it onto the cordon loosely. You don't want to girdle it, and you never want to wrap it either. Don't twist it around the trellis. Just lay it on the trellis and tie it, and that's how you establish a new cordon. So sealing and spraying pruning wounds. Vitaseal can be applied to pruning wounds immediately after pruning just to help seal them, protect them against virus. I've never done this commercially. There are some vineyards that do, but I never have in my career. Or also you can spray fungicide after pruning. Thompson M or Raleigh are good candidates for this. So after you prune, you can immediately go back and spray Raleigh or Thompson M, and this will help protect the vine from diseases as well. It's not going to seal it, but it will help with disease pressures. So removing cut canes from your vineyard. So after you've done all this, you've pruned your entire vineyard, you want to pick up any canes left on the floor. you just remove them out. To do this, it's good to get a rake on a tractor and just drive up and down your rows, pull all the canes out, push them into a big pile and burn them. There's a picture. There's a picture on the left of a rake behind a tractor, and the picture on the right just shows you piles and piles and piles of canes. That's the best way to get rid of them. Truly, you have so much, you just have to burn them. And plus, if you have diseases, if some of these canes are diseased, burning's a good way to get rid of them. All right, so that brings us to the end of the presentation. Kind of a short one here, but if you are a seasoned vet, you know what to do, and this provides as a great refresher. If you're just learning, if you're just getting into vineyard work, I hope this helps you. But that's essentially pruning. Thank you for joining.